Welcome to the Political Philosophy Podcast. I'm Toby Buckle. The 2016 Democratic primary between Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders is the great waterfall moment of inter-left divisions in our age. The left has always been divided against itself. There's always been different factions, but the way we organise our identities, our commitments, and the contour lines between them is all shaped by that. Everything before it is pulled into it, everything after it is churned by it. It is the great waterfall moment, and in many ways that primary never ended. That is an ongoing conflict. One that perhaps involves a comparatively small number of people. Those who are identified with, let's just call it the Bernie faction and the Hillary faction, are a minority of America, to be sure, but this still structurally shapes our politics. It's more than just a few people online. This is something millions of people are still mad about. And the number of people who pick up on it, loosely or partially, they've heard themes or tropes from this debate, and they sort of just get in the back of their head. So the reach these narratives have is quite large. And I think it has clearly impacted the way that the Democratic primary electorate behaves and the divides within that electorate. And we are approaching a decade of this now. If anything, it has become more acrimonious over time. And it has not served us. It has not served us in the fight against fascism, and it has not served us in wanting a more progressive option in American politics. But recently, I've begun to feel more optimistic, and that is not characteristic for me. Two recent events in particular have made me think that we might, and I stress might, be able to move on. The No Kings protest and Mamdani's victory in the New York primary. I think we can move on. It's by no means certain that we do, but the possibility is there, where it wasn't before. I've just done a series of pieces in a few different outlets and for a few different mediums on inter-left divides that kind of all riff off the same themes. I did my Trump trilogy after he won, 3 pieces in Liberal Currents, and then I've kind of done a trilogy starting with my Mapping the Anti-Trump Coalition on the podcast, to my Democratic Tea Party piece in The New Republic, to my recent No Kings piece in Liberal Currents, which almost form a loose trilogy of their own, looking at the other side of the aisle, everything to the left side of the American political spectrum. And in all of those, I kind of took it as axiomatic that 2016 was, as I say, this great waterfall moment for the left. And I found I get 2 reactions to saying that. One, well, yeah, obviously. People who take it for granted as well. And 2, I hadn't thought of that, but it makes sense. So I thought to cap this body of work, and perhaps try to end it with a positive, or at least hopeful note, we could go back and look at that primary. Why it generated the rifts that it did, why they are still with us, and how we might move beyond them. As always, if you like this podcast, please do consider supporting it. I've been devoting a lot of time recently to political commentary and activism, but this is still my primary thing. And yeah, if you appreciate my voice, or at least find me interestingly and informatively wrong, consider chipping in for any amount at patreon.com/politicalphilosophypodcast, patreon.com/politicalphilosophypodcast. All the links to that, as well as all the episodes and all my published work, are just on my website, politicalphilosophypodcast.com, politicalphilosophypodcast.com. And thank you so much to everyone who does support. You're allowing me to continue doing this, which is awesome. So, Apart from that, let's get into the meat of today's episode. This is the Neverending Primary. When countries go to war, it's really common that by the middle to the end of the war, as it's dragged on, the justification, the stated reasons the participants give for why they are fighting, have evolved into something completely different than what they were at the beginning of the conflict. The American Civil War started with the North saying this was about secession and preserving the Union. By the end, it was about ending the institution of slavery. The Vietnam War originally started with France attempting to retain its colonial possessions. It then evolved into, in the justification of Americans, an anti-communist struggle. By the end, the main justification that was being given by Nixon was that there were American prisoners being held in the North and we had to get them back. You ended in this bizarre place where, to hear Nixon talk, you would have thought that the North Vietnamese had kidnapped a bunch of Americans and we'd gone to war to get them back. There's a joke that you ask someone for directions and they say, well, I wouldn't start from here. It's kind of like that, right? If you're in the place where you're fighting a decades-long war for the purpose of returning prisoners of war, you wouldn't start from there, right? I went back over both a lot of the original stuff, the original debates, interviews, what was written at the time with the 2016 Democratic primary, and the more I looked at it, the more I thought, this is what we've done. We've been locked in this fight for so long now. I mean, a decade is a long time in contemporary politics. That our grievances, our stated justifications, have kind of metastasized into something else. We're not fighting about what we were originally fighting about. And as the joke goes, you wouldn't start from here. The first thing, though, to say that is easy to forget now is this might have happened very differently. I think we sort of take it for granted now that there's like a left faction and like a mainline faction within the Democratic Party and within the Democratic Party primary electorate, and that it was sort of natural that two figures, Clinton and Sanders as it were, would emerge as the representatives and do battle. But that's imposing our reality backwards. The left faction, as we think about it, formed to support Sanders' run. There was something in the air at the time, but it was much looser, much more diffuse, and the candidates who came forward might have been very different. The big question at the time was, would Biden run? And doesn't that present an interesting counterfactual? What if it was Biden versus Clinton, and that was the big fight that everyone got polarised by now? Eventually Biden does decide not to run. I think the story there, in its simplest form, is Clinton does the inside baseball a bit better than him. She gets the support of key party figures, most notably Obama, and kind of leaves Biden without much of a leg to stand on. He could run, but it would be humiliating to lose as an incumbent vice president without the president's endorsement. And Biden, I think, is genuinely quite hurt by that. Now, that's a counterfactual people have picked to death. Does Biden win if he runs? Does he win the primary? And does he win the general? Now, Biden himself came to the conclusion that he would have done. And that's one of the big motivations for him running in 2020. I don't know. I think we just don't know. I think it's conventional wisdom now that Biden would have won. I don't know that that's true. On the other side, people forget this. People weren't looking at Sanders. Sanders was kind of a nobody at this point. There was a feeling that we wanted someone to represent a more progressive voice, but the someone people had in mind for that was Elizabeth Warren. And again, if you think about, the identitarian substructures to this debate, how different might that be if it was Warren versus Clinton? I've argued so much that a lot of this debate is sort of implicitly, subconsciously, tacitly gendered. That would be different, presumably, if it was Warren v. Clinton. What if it was a four-way? What if it was Biden, Clinton, Warren, Sanders? Or some combination thereof? The divides that we have, the political identities that we have, could have been very, very, very different. The way we've all factionalised around this primary might not have happened at all. By the time we get to the actual race in history that actually happened, the feeling was that it was Clinton's. Clinton had secured the overwhelming support of the party. There were a few other people in the race, but they were nobodies. Who today remembers Lincoln Chaffrey, Sanders was there. He was there to give the left someone to vote for. But let's remember at this point that the left had not run someone credible. They'd always had a candidate for president, your Denis Kucinich or so on. But no one had ever thought that they would win. Indeed, in Sanders' launch event, one of the most common things the people introducing him and that him said was that we're in it to win it. Which seems weird in retrospect, but what they're saying is we're not just a token candidate, we are a serious candidate. They're preempting the charge that he cannot possibly win, because that is what everyone would have thought at the time. But as the people who floated Warren, although she eventually declined to run, and I wonder what she thinks of that decision now, as the people who floated them knew, there was something in the air at the time. There was a general cloud of grievances that perhaps weren't necessarily best articulated by Sanders himself, but that came to be channeled through him. These were diffuse. Money in politics was something people were getting increasingly irate about. The Citizens United decision had not been that long ago, and I think people were increasingly coming to believe that the political class was bought and paid for. More generally, I think there was a loose buyer's remorse with Obama. He had pursued what I think of as a compromise-first strategy. Most notably with healthcare. Let's start with something that we think can attract Republican votes. And I think there was an increasing thought that this had misread the room, that Republicans were never going to buy in, and so we should just go with the biggest, best thing we could, whatever we think we can ram through with the congressional majorities we had. And perhaps a more general, a more sort of abstract feeling that although people still liked Obama at this point, the left souring on Obama happened later, I think of general feeling that his presidency had not accomplished its promise. A feeling perhaps that the attempt to bring everyone together, to find common ground, had failed. Although nobody, either those who would become the Bernie movement or those who would become mainline libs, had any idea what was coming. This is something I have to keep reminding myself of when I go back to this history. People in the past don't know what's going to happen next. They absolutely did not think, and really could not fathom, that the state was on the brink of fascist collapse. Now, people now, on both sides, have retconned histories where they were warning about it all along. But they weren't. And I say this as someone who was warning about it all along, and I can show receipts that I was. You were incredibly alone. Trump was a joke at this point, not an existential threat. 538, before Nate Silver went insane, gave him a 30% chance of winning, and this was felt to be a ridiculously alarmist take. Attention-seeking for the sake of it. The Economist's model gave Hillary a 98% chance of winning. Trump could not win. So, although this is in part what the debate became about, what are the causes of American fascism and how do we defeat it, it's not how it started. When Bernie Sanders launched his campaign, he wasn't talking about, we're facing a rising threat of the far right, and to counter it, we need a bold socialist policy offer. No, he was saying, look, we need a bold socialist policy offer. It was just a thing in itself, right? Also, interestingly, he promised to run a purely positive campaign. I have never run a negative ad in my life. I'm not going to be attacking the other candidates. This is me giving a positive vision of the future. And that's one of the things that attracted people to him in the first place. That was a bit of a breath of fresh air. I'm not going to engage in this tit for tat. Now, that promise would not survive the campaign. He did all right with it. Hillary certainly went on the attack first, and Bernie at some points did at least attempt to restore a sort of more collegial atmosphere. He famously said in one of the debates, "I'm sick and tired of hearing about your damn emails," essentially siding with Clinton that the press had over-egged this scandal. He would eventually come to attack her as the establishment and start to use much stronger language, but only towards the end of the campaign. Which I thought was interesting, given how much we identify that faction today with a sort of vitriolic and indeed often mindless sort of anti-democrat messaging. That wasn't at all there when Bernie started. Like I say, Hillary was the one who went after him first. In the first debate, Bernie largely just sort of said what he thought, and Hillary went after Bernie, and interestingly, went after him for not being progressive enough. This is the thing about history. It's always a bit different to how you remember it, right? She went after him for his poor record on gun control, which, to be fair, Bernie does have a pretty mixed record on this. And I remember watching it and thinking, what are you doing, Hillary? But that's me imposing a sort of modern conception of the left onto him, thinking, don't you know people are really frickin' tribal about Bernie, and if you go after him too hard or unfairly, they get really frickin' upset, and they have an absolute paranoia that the Democratic establishment is out to get them. Hillary, maybe shut up, maybe just focus on a positive vision. People like me can write articles with titles like "Why the Democratic Tea Party Failed." You cannot say those things if you want those votes. But Hillary didn't know any of that, because none of that had happened yet. Again, people in the past don't know what's going to happen, right? She didn't know just how motivated people were going to become about the Bernie campaign and just how much they would stake their identities to it. She was just looking at someone challenging her as being insufficiently progressive, and she was clapping back. Well, it's not as if you have a great record on gun rights. That was just all in the game to her. Talking of the first debate, should we have a listen? Let's go back, and we're obviously not going to cover the whole thing. It's like 2.5 hours long. Let's have a listen to the opening pitches of the candidates. This is essentially how Bernie and Hillary introduced themselves to the Democratic primary electorate, or reintroduced themselves in Hillary's case. There were 3 other candidates on the stage who do not matter at all for this story, so I'm not going to spend time on them. But let's look at the main 2. This is how Bernie opened.
Senator O'Malley, thank you very much. Senator Sanders.
Anderson, thank you very much. I think most Americans understand that our country today faces a series of unprecedented crises. The middle class of this country for the last 40 years has been disappearing. Millions of Americans are working longer hours for lower wages, and yet almost all of the new income and wealth being created is going to the top 1%. As a result of this disastrous Citizens United Supreme Court decision, our campaign finance system is corrupt and is undermining American democracy. Millionaires and billionaires are pouring unbelievable sums of money into the political process in order to fund super PACs and to elect candidates who represent their interests, not the interests of working people. Today, the scientific community is virtually unanimous. Climate change is real, it is caused by human activity, and we have a moral responsibility to transform our energy system away from fossil fuel to energy efficiency and sustainable energy, and leave this planet a habitable planet for our children and our grandchildren. Today in America, we have more people in jail than any other country on earth. African American youth unemployment is 51%. Hispanic youth unemployment is 36%. It seems to me that instead of building more jails and providing more incarceration, maybe, just maybe, we should be putting money into education and jobs for our kids. This campaign is whether we can mobilize our people to take back our government from a handful of billionaires and create the vibrant democracy we know we can and should have. Thank you.
Okay, so that was Bernie's opening gambit, and here's Hillary.
Secretary Clinton?
Well, thank you, and thanks to everyone for hosting this first of the Democratic debates. I'm Hillary Clinton. I have been proud and privileged to serve as First Lady, as a senator from New York, and as Secretary of State. I'm the granddaughter of a factory worker and the grandmother of a wonderful one-year-old child. And every day I think about what we need to do to make sure that opportunity is available, not just for her, but for all of our children. I have spent a very long time, my entire adult life, looking for ways to even the odds to help people have a chance to get ahead. And in particular, to find the ways for each child to live up to his or her God-given potential. I've traveled across our country over the last months listening and learning, and I've put forward specific plans about how we're going to create more good-paying jobs by investing in infrastructure and clean energy, by making it possible once again to invest in science and research, and taking the opportunity posed by climate change to grow our economy. At the center of my campaign is how we're going to raise wages. Yes, of course, raise the minimum wage, but we have to do so much more, including finding ways so that companies share profits with the workers who help to make them. And then we have to figure out how we're going to make the tax system a fairer one. Right now, the wealthy pay too little and the middle class pays too much. So I have specific recommendations about how we're going to close those loopholes, make it clear that the wealthy will have to pay their fair share, and have a series of tax cuts for middle-class families. And I want to do more to help us balance family and work. I believe in equal pay for equal work for women, but I also believe it's about time we had paid family leave for American families and join the rest of the world. During the course of the evening tonight, I'll have a chance to lay out all of my plans and the work that I've done behind them. But for me, this is about bringing our country together again. And I will do everything I can to heal the divides economically, because there's too much inequality, the racial divides, the continuing discrimination against the LGBT community, so that we will work together. And yes, finally, fathers will be able to say to their daughters, you too can grow up to be president.
Isn't it interesting to sort of go back to old debates and how they align with where we are today? Like I say, the causes aren't the same, they've evolved. You'll notice both of them hit on economic and social justice, this sort of framework in which discrimination is downstream of like economic inequality. That hadn't quite come online yet, that wasn't as prominent. Also note In the left's memory, Hillary is this neoliberal sellout who doesn't care at all about inequality, but her casus belli is inequality. Hillary's campaign launch was much shorter than Bernie's. Bernie's had this whole 2-hour thing that was honestly quite difficult to watch through. Hillary's was kind of naff in the opposite way, and it was this 3-minute over-PR'd sort of cutesy video. But the one substantive issue she mentions in it is inequality. They both sound reasonably progressive to me, right? Am I wrong? They're both like, what's the basic thing both of them are saying? America's too unequal and we need to do stuff about that. Like, the system isn't working for and in some ways is working against ordinary people. And there's too much racism and discrimination. They say it in slightly different ways. I'll also add, I think we have this idea now that Hillary was a uniquely bad candidate because she lost to Trump. When I listen to her, I don't see that. I see a reasonably good public speaker. Certainly in the debates, she's a better debater than Bernie. She's faster on her feet. She can, think in real time and come up with a comeback, whereas he tends to just circle back to his core points. Nonetheless, if I were to declare a winner in that debate, and even just in the 2 clips that you heard, not in terms of who's right ultimately, but in terms of who did more to advance their campaign, I would say obviously Bernie. Now, at a surface level, the sort of descriptive claims that they're making are quite similar, right? They're both saying the country is too unequal and we need to do more about that. But below the surface, think about the emotional and moral substructure of what they're saying. What we communicate isn't just about, this is my policy, this is my description of the problem. It's about, how do we feel about that? What are the moral stakes of that? And that's where I think Bernie clearly distinguishes himself. I think this idea that Bernie's policy is radically to the left of a sort of centre-right Democratic Party has always been a bit confused. Yes, he's more policy left, certainly, but that's not what caused people to gravitate here. Like I say, it's the emotional and moral substructure of what they're saying. To try and maybe clarify that for a bit, in the 2 clips I just played you, ask yourself this question: who is the villain in this story? For Hillary, it's a bit unclear, right? Opportunity has not been shared equally. Okay, so maybe it's like the system is the villain? It's hard to say, right? For Bernie, who's the villain? The billionaires are the villain. The billionaires are bad people who are doing bad things that make the country bad, right? Like, it's a much more linear story. Hillary's story doesn't have a villain in quite the same way, I think. And I think that's why it doesn't quite pack the same punch, even though, as I said, in some ways she's the more technically competent speaker. Now, also put this in context. Bernie's going to get a lot of support from young people, right? Think about just the history that's happened over the last 10 years. For people who this is their first, second, third election, these are people who came into the workforce during or after the 2008 crash. People who had spent a lot of money to go to college, being told that that was their way into the middle class and that's what you need to do, acquired a lot of debt and then graduated into an economy that didn't have a place for them. What's going to resonate more? A story that, yes, is about inequality, but doesn't have that same moral punch to it? Or a story that's about inequality and gives you a clear person to blame and a plausible person to blame? I don't think it's hard to see why Bernie resonated more, right? I think what we also have in Sanders and Hillary is kind of just 2 different political archetypes. And these are as old as time, really. I call them Catos and Ciceros. So, and this may well not be historically accurate, but as we remember these figures, right? Cato was someone in the Roman Republic who was known for being obstinate, being principled, being, part of the Senate and a powerful elite, but kind of an outsider in a lot of ways. The person who, from the periphery, is saying, this is wrong, this is not in accordance with our values. Cicero was much more of an insider. He's remembered today for his eloquence in speeches, although if you actually read them, that may more be in the self-reporting. But he was someone who made deals, who liked to be at the centre of power, who would compromise to get things done. And they both characters have resonance today. They also, if you want a sort of dark omen, both died resisting the transition of Rome from a republic into a de facto monarchy, so, there's that. But I think they're just different archetypes, aren't they? So obviously Bernie's a Cato, right? Catos can have some real adherence, and there is a certain power to always being clear on your principles, even if it's not practical. But Catos struggle to move from the periphery to the centre. They struggle to adapt their message to new circumstances. But they're seen as more authentic, more trustworthy. Cicero's might effect more change. They might, as Hillary will be able to here, be able to point to more concrete things that they've done. And certainly that was a line of attack used on Bernie in this primary. Like, he's been in Congress all this time. What has he actually achieved, right? But Cicero's are always dragging around the hurt feelings people have who got on the wrong side of their last decision. Cicero himself famously is haunted his whole career by his decision to execute without a trial some members of a conspiracy against the Roman state. May have been the right or wrong decision, but a lot of people had hurt feelings about it. Likewise with Hillary, she can certainly point to a lot more stuff that she's done, but she's also got a lot more stuff wrong. There's a lot more unforced errors, and there's a lot more compromises. And this is the thing about wielding power. There will always be mistakes here. Also, your realists, your Ciceros, often appear insincere. Now, is that always fair? No. I think what Hillary Clinton is trying to say throughout this debate is, I have very clear sort of centre-of-the-left progressive principles. I just want to achieve them. I'm not content to just be right in theory. Now, do I believe Hillary or not? It's not really the point. The point is, it's true enough of the time that politicians don't have principles, that at a time when people are feeling frustrated, they often just won't trust a Cicero. They'll go to a Cato. Ultimately, what I'm not saying is one's better or one's worse. I think these are just two political archetypes, and there are good and bad versions of each. I think people just tend to be instinctively drawn to one or the other. And I'd ask you, which of those little quick character sketches that I've done appeals to you more? And I bet you that aligns with which side of this you support. And, this isn't unique to the left, certainly. If you want an example from the other side, Ron Paul, who had a sort of niche primary campaign that got some support in 2008 and 2012. He might have run in 2016, I'd have to check. No, he didn't. It was 2008 and 2012. Ron Paul's a Cato, right? And it's interesting that there is a certain number of people who liked Bernie who had liked Ron Paul, who had been for Ron Paul in, say, 2008, maybe even 2012, and then moved over to Bernie in 2016. Now, that does not make any sense at all ideologically. These are just literally diametrically opposed worldviews. But in terms of what archetypes, what sort of political myths appeal to you, it does make a certain sort of sense. People who like a Cato, and this was a moment for a Cato, liked Bernie. I think a final point of who liked Bernie is within what I think of as the activist class within the Democratic Party, people who knock on doors, people who post on social media too much online or have blogs or have YouTube channels, were getting annoyed with the party at the time. I think a lot of people felt that the party had kind of become a closed club, that people like them, be that ideological, demographic, temperamentally, were being kept out. And as someone in the activist class at that time, that is not a totally inaccurate perception. The Democratic Party was not succeeding. Apart from Obama being re-elected and being generally quite popular, albeit perhaps not with the proto-left, we were getting slaughtered down ballot. We were just losing state senate race after state senate race with the same bland, vacuous messaging and learning nothing from it. And the people leading all that, the sort of much maligned consultants, the insiders, the people who ran firms, were arrogantly contemptuous of anyone who suggested that anything be done differently. And they were both quite stupid, and that special type of, like, upper middle class went to, has a fancy degree, and look, I have a fancy degree, but they can't be told that they're stupid. They don't even take feedback well, And so what formed around Bernie was kind of people who'd been shut out of the Democratic Party for both legitimate and illegitimate reasons, and that would have a consequence. Bernie was not very good at making hiring decisions. It's one of his great weaknesses. And, if you think about a lot of the people who were prominent advocates, Brooke Joy Gray, or, the most obvious example would be Tulsi Gabbard. There's a lot of people who were obviously at the time, kind of just grifters who had been shut out of the party for a reason. But there were also a lot of talented people who the party really should have been using their talents and wasn't, because they were kind of snobby, essentially, and would do great things for Bernie and would really create a movement that was vital and had energy and staying power. And so it's both, and I think it came from frustration from people who were kind of in the activist class on the periphery of the party for quite a wide variety of reasons. Now, for the sort of good side of that, the people who bought into it for sort of quote-unquote the right reasons, this is sometimes discussed as passion and enthusiasm, which it certainly was, but I want to try and be a bit more specific than that. This is the identitarian, expressivist component of politics. The idea that a political figure, movement, group, or ideas represents who you are. That they are an avatar of you. That this is part of your expression of yourself. Now, to be clear, I don't think this is necessarily bad. I think there are better and worse. I think there are better and worse ways of having an identitarian component of politics. I don't know that it's even desirable for politics to be a sort of passionless, bloodless, rational deliberation, but it's certainly not possible. Like I say, though, this is something that can go in good and bad directions. So I think a very obvious bad direction we could point to would be Trump. I think with Trump, there are a lot of people whose identity is being a Trump supporter. Maybe not all of the movement, but there are many people for whom it's not that they think, well, I believe in X, Y, and Z, Trump is fighting for X, Y, and Z, therefore I support Trump. There's plenty of people like that. But I think there's also who people think, I am a Trump supporter. I support Trump. So if Trump supports X, Y, and Z, I support X, Y, and Z, right? It's not about issues, it's about identity. Now, to be fair to the left, I think hardly anyone on the left thinks about Bernie Sanders that way. I don't think, if Bernie Sanders came out and said something terrible, I think people, by and large, and the left have criticised Bernie Sanders when they feel like he's not living up to their ideals. I think the sort of identitarian part is more to the group than the figure in the case of the Sanders left. It's that part of their identity is I am a socialist, or I am a lefty, or like this is my tribe, this is my group. And that's not bad per se. I think a liability of it that has got the left into trouble is putting your identity into a very morally black and white narrative can risk being quite insular. You see this with, like, religions all the time, right? Is like anyone criticising us from the outside is a bad person by virtue of being on the outside. And that can just make it quite hard for them to course correct. And this sort of insularity has really haunted this faction since its inception. And I think all the more so because the loyalty, the identitarian stake is to the group, not a figure, that does prevent, or at least limit the potential for abuses of power, as in the Trumpian case. But it also, again, makes it hard to course correct, because criticism is kind of like wrestling with fog. Because when you say, I think the left is getting this wrong, the sort of question is, well, who are you talking about? Like a bunch of people yelling online, a sort of bunch of, like, semi-important influencers. There's no, like, pope of the left who can tell them they're getting it wrong, and just complaining about people yelling online feels small and petty and kind of pointless, because you can't impose message discipline over that. But when that group as a whole does become locked into bad narratives, it then becomes very hard for them to course correct. And I think, again, it's not that an identitarian stake in politics is bad. I have an identitarian stake in politics. I think it's you do want to think critically and self-consciously about what your identitarian stakes are and what their liabilities are. So, back to the campaign. The story of the campaign itself is this long saga that I actually think isn't that important for understanding the divides that go forward. But basically the story of the campaign is this. After being seen as something of a fringe candidate, Sanders surges. Wins some early states, Clinton wins some early states, and then you go into the big block Super Tuesday states. Sanders does very well, Clinton does better. She has both a popular vote and a delegate lead. And then you get a long cycle of there's states on the horizon that look good for Bernie, so he stays in for them, and he does pretty good, but not enough to close the gap. And it's always frustratingly just a bit too far behind to catch up, but not so far behind that he's clearly knocked out. And that, I think, really just kind of creates an environment that just frays everyone's nerves. But the basic story of the campaign is Bernie's always just a bit too far behind to catch up, but it always looks like, he maybe just might, and he stays in. I think what falls out of that is a failure on both sides to bring it back together, to coordinate an end of the primary. And Hillary and Bernie, I think, particularly by the end of it, just don't seem to like each other very much. In contrast to Biden and Bernie 4 years later, who apparently had a reasonable personal relationship. I think Sanders never quite worked out how to end his campaign and stayed in. I mean, certainly I think once the New York primary had happened, it was over for him, but he stays in for months after that in what had become a very vitriolic campaign. And one of the big criticisms of him in retrospect is that he should have dropped out a lot earlier. At the same time, Hillary doesn't push him and doesn't declare victory. She sort of waits for it to finally wrap up and become official, and then I think isn't able to offer an off-ramp to Sanders supporters in the way that Biden was. And I don't think it's a matter of policy concessions. I think Hillary did make a few nods to the left. Biden made much more substantive nods. I think it's just where everyone was at. I think Biden and Sanders came together much more easily because the threat was much more obviously real, and as I say, I think they just had a better personal relationship. The threat was not real at this point. People were not taking it seriously, and I don't think people quite felt the stakes of needing to reunite the left, and to the extent that they did, I think both sides were pretty inept at it. I think, who's to blame for the fact that this never quite reconciled? I think both of them, honestly. With all that said, I think if Hillary had won, this would all be basically fine, right? For all that this got really heated towards the end, I think the Bernie movement would have continued in some form under a Clinton presidency, but it wouldn't look like the way the divides have mapped to now. And I don't think what we've stayed fighting about is really the campaign itself. I think it's three things, or three sort of narratives that emerged from stuff that happened later that are kind of the inception points of our current divides. Like I say, what the primary started by talking about is not what we're talking about now. Those three things are the hack and DNC scandal, abstention, and what I just think of as the Bernie would have won narrative. So let's do them each in turn. The hack and DNC scandal. So this was part of the WikiLeaks thing, if you can remember that. But as the campaign was wrapping up, WikiLeaks released thousands of messages from the email accounts of Democratic National Committee staff. And what these show is that people who work from the DNC do not like Sanders very much. Interestingly, they discussed that his atheism might harm him in a general election. And this led to a general feeling that the people who were supposed to be the arbiters of the campaign had been in the bag for Hillary all along. This caused a huge furor and eventually led to the then DNC chair, Debbie Wasserman Schultz, who's I think a congresswoman now, having to resign. There's a lot of ins and outs to this one that I won't go into. Here's my overall assessment of it. Here's sort of what happened. There were a number of people in the DNC who clearly preferred Hillary to Sanders. Also, there was a fundraising agreement between Hillary and the DNC where she gave them money in exchange for a greater say in decision-making. Sanders was offered one but declined it. He didn't want to give money to the DNC. That is kind of sketch, right? I think clearly what you can say is there was a bit of an advantage to Hillary here. Now, this narrative has then metastasized into it was rigged against Bernie, where rigged is really an undefined word. Like, were there systematic advantages to Hillary? Almost certainly. Particularly in structural features of how the Democrats worked. For instance, there were still superdelegates back then, so party insiders had a sort of weighted voice in the process. I would also just say, like, when you're dealing with something like this, the appearance of impropriety is impropriety, right? Like, if a judge takes a lavish gift from someone whose trial they're presiding over, it doesn't matter if that actually influenced the decision. Like, you shouldn't have taken the gift, right? Now, with all that said, was there anything illegal here? No. Did it change the outcome? Almost certainly not. Hillary won this by 3 million votes, 16 million to 13 million. The DNC just didn't have that kind of power. Like, maybe she got a slightly preferable debate ordering or something. But like I say, after everyone's nerves were fried through this long, uncomfortably too close primary, people were so angry about this. And to be fair to the Democrats, they did reform a lot afterwards. They got rid of superdelegates. They made the process much more transparent. They did not, as a party, really go all in behind a figure in the way that all the sort of key endorsements went to Hillary in 2016. Biden really ran by himself. So Bernie Sanders in 2020 was facing a much more level playing field than he was in 2016. So I think that the sort of my take on this is it wasn't great. And I'm not going to fully defend the Democrats here. It also probably wasn't outcome determinative. And it wasn't something that really persisted, I don't think. I think people got really angry about it and made a really big stink. And I think the Democrats were kind of a bit shamefaced and backed off and changed their rules and cleaned up their act a bit. The narrative, however, persisted, and it took on a life of its own, that this was rigged against Bernie. And there were a lot of people to this day who really, really believed that Bernie was cheated out of it in a much more fundamental sense, like ballot boxes were being stuffed. Right? Not that there was this kind of complicated to explain fundraising agreement that maybe kind of benefited Clinton, but probably didn't change the outcome, but that Bernie would have won, but the DNC literally changed the tallies. There are a lot of people who believe that to this day, and will never forgive the Democratic Party for it. Right? And then this resurfaces in 2020, and it all sort of combines with this, we're against this establishment and we're against big money, that we are absolutely being unfairly disadvantaged here. The Democrats are the system and they are out to get us. And in the 2020 campaign, it was honestly kind of ridiculous. Like I say, Bernie had a leveled playing field. He lost on his own in that race, but the narrative became the Democrats cheated us out of this. And the story was the whole establishment lined up to endorse Biden after his South Carolina victory, but Elizabeth Warren stayed in to split votes from Bernie, and this was all a conspiracy against him. This is just not a good narrative. For one thing, if your campaign cannot withstand the counter-endorsement of Amy Klobuchar, you were not on to a winner to begin with. For another, despite being similar ideologically, Elizabeth Warren and Sanders in 2020 were drawing from quite different pools of voters. There were a lot of people, I've talked to a lot of them in my Democratic Tea Party piece, who were originally for Warren, but then went to Biden when it became a straight choice. Sanders was a deal breaker for them, for reasons I'll get on to. And when you look at the stats, it's about 50-50. Of the people who had been supporting Warren, about half went to Bernie, about half went to Biden. I don't think her getting out early and endorsing Bernie changes that much. He lost that race by 10 million votes. 2-1, 19 million to 9, right? Yeah, maybe 100,000 more might have followed Warren, but that is not even close to being outcome determinative, right? And then in smaller races, you get the same thing. Nina Turner, this is my absolute go-to for why the left loses, when she lost her special congressional primary election to Shontel Brown, said, we weren't defeated, big money conspired against us. Just like this, we can't win. The establishment and big money are out to get us. They're always cheaters. I've started calling this electoral incels. You're obsessed with elections. It's all you want is to win elections, and you've convinced yourself that you can't and that the world is out to get you. Turner did not lose because of fundraising. She fundraised hundreds of thousands of dollars. She had a media spotlight on her because the online left really focused on that case, on that race. She lost because she refused to say if she'd voted for Hillary Clinton in 2016 and compared voting for Biden in 2020 to eating a bowl of shit. That's why she lost, right? And again, this sort of combines with the insularity to become a negative feedback loop. Because the left is so insular, it can't self-reflect. It can't think, what did we do wrong or say wrong in these races? When it loses, it has its narrative. And this just continues to reinforce that narrative. You get into this negative feedback loop. It also combines with the billionaires are the root of all evil thing to form the anti-establishment left narrative. Trump was caused by the Democrats because of the Democrats' refusal to stop neoliberalism, because the Democrats didn't address inequality. And remember, what was Hillary's number one thing that she was running on in 2016? Inequality. But because of the Democrats' supposed refusal to address inequality and the billionaires, that's what caused Trump. Now, that doesn't make sense logically, that Democratic Party rigging elections equals Democratic Party causing Trump. But it kind of makes sense emotionally. Again, a lot of politics isn't about logical descriptive claims, it's about emotional and moral substructures beneath those claims. And the substructure is the primary thing wrong with the world is the Democratic Party. Yes, Trump is very bad, certainly, but it's the Democrats who caused him. And if only they'd have let us win, we'd have beaten him, right? And the problem is, Democratic primary voters, as I detail at length in my Democratic Tea Party piece, hate that narrative. They don't buy it. They don't buy it for a variety of valid reasons, and they won't vote for people pushing it. But again, it's a negative feedback loop. Because the left keeps losing, it kind of reinforces that narrative, and then the narrative ensures that they keep losing. So what was kind of needed was a big win to break them out of that. And I think they got that. I'm recording a few days after literally a day and a half after, the New York primary election won by Madami, favourite of the left, beating Cuomo, who is one of the worst politicians ever to achieve high office, including Republicans, and doing more or less what I counselled, running as the more partisan Democrat, as the person who represents the party, and as Cuomo as someone outside the party. And I can feel a bit of a vibe shift on this one. A lot of people are saying the reason he won is because he ran as being a proud partisan Democrat and as representing the party. And I think that kind of, in a way, breaks this negative feedback loop, that the Democrats are the root of all evil, the Democrats are conspiring to take elections from us, the Democrats caused Trump, is like, well, we are the Democrats now. That is the nominee in New York. And it falsifies this narrative of, like, the establishment are cheating you. You just won. You won fair and square. You know, no one cheated you. Yes, some idiots like Bill Clinton endorsed Cuomo. They shouldn't have done that. I think it's highly discrediting, but you still won. You still can win. You know? So I think we might be able to finally start to move beyond that narrative. But that narrative of seeing the Democrats as the root of all evil, the ones we get angry with, the ones we place agency on, and the ones we think are denying us our rightful wins, that narrative has been a huge part of the left for the past 10 years, maybe 8 years, but still, right? That has really defined them. What about on the other side? The big thing that alienated what became mainline liberals from the left was the claim, and I'll get into whether it's true or not, the claim that Sanders supporters abstained in the general election, causing Trump to win. This is a very contentious claim that has been debated back and forth ever since then. Let me talk you through it slowly. There are different estimates of how many Sanders supporters did indeed go on to back Hillary, and how many eventually either went third party, voted Trump, or just sat it out, right? What was certainly the case is that there was a very loud and vocal so-called Bernie or bust movement urging abstention, right? And that this frustrated a lot of people who wanted us to focus on beating Trump. There are slightly different estimates, but let me get out of the way a bit of a misnomer first. What you will often get from the anti-establishment... I've spent a long time on this question, by the way. What you will often get from the anti-establishment left, the Bernie left, is only 12% of Bernie Sanders' primary supporters voted Trump in the general. And that's actually a lot less than normal. For instance, in 2008, 25% of Hillary Clinton supporters ended up voting for McCain. So look, Bernie actually did a pretty good job of getting his supporters over. That's kind of become one of their staples, and again, because they're quite insular, they can't course correct. Almost everything about that is wrong. The Hillary Clinton number is almost certainly too high. It was quite high. There was quite a number of Hillary Clinton primary voters who went over to McCain, but it wasn't 25%. That comes from this one study. Most show more like 12, 14%. Still quite high, but a bit of a different era of politics. Even though it's only 8 years before, that sort of like people moving between the parties is kind of over. By the time we get to 2016, we're into hardcore locked-in partisan identities. For 2, there's something just a bit weird about that defense. It's a bit like someone in court saying, like, yeah, I'm charged with a murder, but this other guy committed 5 murders. What about him? Like it doesn't... It's an obfuscation, and I think mainline liberals are right to feel that it's an obfuscation. Now, weirdly, I think it's almost certainly too high a figure for how many Bernie Sanders supporters voted Trump. I don't think it's 12. I think it's more like 6 or 7. Mid-single digits. That's not what went wrong. What went wrong is a lot of Bernie Sanders primary voters went to third-party candidates or abstained. Right? Now, there's various estimates for this. My best guess, and this is from a Blair Center study, is that it'd be about 74% of... I'm just quoting the Blair Center study here. 74% of Bernie Sanders' primary support went to Hillary. So most, 3/4, right, went to Hillary. About 10 million votes out of 13.5. So if we say all Bernie Sanders supporters, that's certainly wrong. Most Bernie Sanders supporters did vote Hillary. And then the rest kind of smatter between Stein, Johnson, write-ins, and don't vote, all getting mid-single digits. So you've got about 6% for Trump. So you've got like a smattering of the remaining quarter, kind of goes everywhere. Interestingly, that remaining quarter have the highest levels of modern-day sexism. Now, was that outcome determinative in the general election? Almost certainly. So let's just focus on Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan. If Hillary could have carried those, she'd have won the presidency. In all of those, the vote of Jill Stein is higher than the margin for Trump. So Trump wins Pennsylvania with 2.9 million votes and a margin of 44,000. Stein gets 49,000. Gary Johnson 146,000. Wisconsin, the difference, it's only 22,000 votes. Trump wins it by. Stein gets 31,000. Gary Johnson gets 106,000. And in Michigan, only 10,000 votes are in it for Trump's victory. Stein gets 51,000 and Gary Johnson gets 176,000. Now, you do need to be careful with that, because I think there are a lot of Stein voters who would never have supported the party nominee anyway, even if it were Bernie. Like, their thing is they want to vote Green. And indeed, by a bit of back-of-the-envelope math, my guesstimate would be actually less than half of Stein's voters are former Sanders voters. So we can't assume that every Stein voter is a Bernie person. They're not. But there's also abstainers in on top of that. And there's also, weirdly, quite a lot of Bernie to Gary Johnson voters. More voters actually went from Bernie to Libertarian Gary Johnson than went to Green Party Jill Stein. So puzzle that one out, right? Here's a simpler way of doing it. What are we actually asking the left to have done here? Are they going to be able to deliver 100% of Bernie Sanders' primary vote? No, I think not. I think there were probably a few Trump supporters, Republicans, who voted Bernie Sanders in the primary just to stick it to Hillary because they figured she'd win. Bernie Sanders himself probably wouldn't have carried those. So I think 100% is unrealistic. Here's what maybe could have happened. Here's your counter history. What if Like, what if Bernie gets out earlier and all of the left really feels the threat more and kind of hectors their own people into voting? And we have a concrete case of when that happened, which is 2020. Bernie drops out much earlier, endorses Biden, does so more positively, and the left is kind of on it a bit more. And ultimately, instead of 74%, 91% of Bernie Sanders' primary supporters in 2020 ultimately go to Biden. So if that had happened in 2016 instead, would Hillary have won? Certainly. Absolutely, without a doubt. So if I take, I've done a bit of math here, 25% of Bernie Sanders' primary support in those key states, if all the support goes to Hillary, that's like an extra 200,000 votes in each state. Easily wins. I think the 25% is unreasonable. Let's say, not even at 2020 levels, let's say instead of 75% of Bernie, or 74%, sorry, of Bernie Sanders supporters going to Hillary, let's say 85% do. We give him an extra 10%. That gives Hillary 73,000 more votes in Pennsylvania to a margin of 44, 57,000 more in Wisconsin to a margin of 31, to a margin of 22, and 59,000 more in Michigan to a margin of 10. So if the left had rallied behind Clinton to just the same degree that, in fact, a little less than they did with Biden, then yes, Hillary would have won. It was outcome determinative. And I've spent a million years with those numbers, as you can tell, but that debate is kind of over now. And if people give you the, like, oh, well, more Hillary Clinton supporters switched over to McCain in 2008, so what? Like, the numbers are wrong and the argument is wrong. And another thing is I'd stress how little sense this makes in terms of the stated objectives of the campaign. Money in politics was their casus belli. The Supreme Court is the main determinant of that. The main thing that we could have done to change money in politics was win in 2016 with either Bernie or Hillary, it didn't matter, and move from a 4-4 to a 5-4 Supreme Court, or at the very least avoid the 6-3 one that we're now on. But it wasn't based in reasons, it was based in anger and emotion and identity. People felt, not completely without reason, although certainly exaggerated, that the primary election had been stolen from them. And they were just not going to fucking do it. They just weren't going to vote. Now, narratives were offered. There was this idea of, oh, it'll force the Democrats to come meet us in the middle next time. There was the idea of accelerationism. There was this idea that, oh, if Trump wins, he'll bring the revolution and it'll sort of get us to a socialism or barbarism type moment. But again, that's not quite what it's become. What it's become is the left feels that it's unfair that it was defined by this moment, while continually threatening to abstain again, and never quite disowning it. I was reading Corey Robbins' blog, who's a sort of academic, but a sort of good stand-in for the sort of Bernie left. Very strong Bernie supporter, very vitriolic Clinton critic indeed. He spent almost all of his time in the 2016 election criticising Hillary, not Trump. His last post, he said, "This is ridiculous that the left is being blamed in advance. There will not be any significant left abstention." And then when people called him on it afterwards in his post after the election, he admitted he got it wrong, that he thought Hillary would definitely win, and he admitted he got that one wrong. But when the issue of abstention came up, which remember he'd said was a complete myth, and I think we now know wasn't, it was a significant factor. This is what he said. I'm going to quote him to you at length. Quote, "If you're planning on popping up in a comments thread about Trump and mouthing off about how I should now apologise for being part of Bernie or Bust or Never Hillary or whatever name you come up with, contingent, let me set you straight on a few things. One, you are a guest, most likely an uninvited guest, who's plopping down on my living room floor like a drunken fool, taking advantage of my hospitality and your fellow guests' politeness, so you can ride whatever hobby horse your ignorance and six-pack have set you on for the evening. Second, you don't know what you're talking about. I was certainly not part of any Bernie or Bust or Never Hillary clue. I didn't support Jill Stein, and most of the people who participate in my comments threads weren't and didn't either. Nor am I going to allow you to vilify people who were part of those contingents. They have their reasons for their politics, and if you're going to show up at my house, you're going to respectfully engage and critique those reasons. And if you can't, you can take that shit to Reddit or whatever democratic hack blog you ordinarily cruise for clicks. End quote. Okay, that, I don't know if it was like Robin's post particularly, but that became the attitude of the left when called on this. Look, I didn't do it personally, but I'm not going to say those who did anything wrong, and while we're at it, go fuck yourself. Right? That became the left's attitude to do with this. I think part of this is that he just got caught flat-footed. He thought this would be a blowout, and it wasn't. He thought, yeah, if a few people sit it out, and Hillary's margin is like only all right instead of extravagant, who cares? Maybe that's even good. Would he have said the same thing if he knew this was going to be a nail-biter? Dunno, hard to say. He certainly really hated Hillary, but also, did he want to be blamed for her losing? I think that's kind of what this is about. There's afterwards this element of he just doesn't want to say he got it wrong, so he doubles down on it. And there's an element of like, you're not putting the blame for this on us. And yet there's something else as well. There's something behind this that mainline liberals have always read into this answer, and I think are correct to do it, which is that he at least partly sympathises with the abstainers. He thinks at least partly they got it right. And again, there's the surface level, what is being said, and then there's the emotional moral substructure. There's the sort of, what are people hearing? What are they? What are liberals hearing here? It's something like, we don't want to vote Democrat, it's a bad, nasty, contaminated thing, and it's an injustice that we're quote-unquote forced to. And that you don't ever get to criticise our voting choices. If people don't vote, they're justified in that, and that's your fault. And if you try and persuade them, that's vote shaming. And this became a huge phrase that the left would use for over a decade. If you ever try to talk people out of abstention, that's vote shaming. Otherwise known as making an argument. We didn't want to do it, and we don't want to be told that we're wrong. There's a few different things going on here with left abstention. It's kind of like a complicated myriad. There's an identitarian component. We've got to the point where we very strongly identify with the Democratic Party as the enemy, both because they steal elections and because they cause Trump, and we don't want to vote for them. Right? That's not, the Democratic Party does not represent who I am, the left abstainer says. There's also a gender element. The what I call the reaction narrative, the Democrats caused Trump, in a sense, has a strongly gendered component for reasons that I've discussed, because liberalism and the Democratic Party are coded as female. I think there is also a no-shit moral purity element. And again, purity is a moral framework for looking at things with. It is neither good or bad, but like all moral frameworks, it has strengths and it has liabilities. But I think there is a people I've talked to have talked about feeling like they had dirty hands voting for Biden. And I think there is a sort of moral contamination element to it. I think also in the way the left has just never quite said, yeah, abstention was wrong, we're not going to encourage that or like wink at it anymore. I think there is also just a pride element to this. We won't kiss the ring. and to a certain extent, sure, backing off anything can feel like a humiliation. And again, with insularity, this comes with that. This is one of the dark sides of passionate identification with a cause. Compromise is not humiliation. Admitting error is not humiliation. Working with others is not humiliation. When I said in my Democratic Tea Party piece, yeah, the left should apologise for this, the reaction was, we're not going to lick your boots. That's almost a direct quote from hundreds of people. But the idea that people should say that they got things wrong is being processed this way is, I think, a sign of how far wrong things have gone. Right? Like when asked for directions, you wouldn't start from here, right? People get things wrong all the time. In many ways, the Biden presidency was at least a tacit admission that the Obama administration's compromise first policy had got things wrong. They didn't do it that way. They approached most legislation in a very partisan manner, and they went big early. That was a tacit admission that the administration that Biden had been the vice president of had got it wrong, right? And even Obama said, if I had to do it today, I'd do it differently. There are many people who supported Ralph Nader in 2000, which arguably was outcome determinative in George Bush winning, who have been some of the staunchest advocates for voting Democrat now because they recognise that they got it wrong. And I don't consider those people bad people or my enemies. Some of the best liberals I know were Nader 2000 supporters, right? People get stuff wrong. It's not a humiliation to say that. I just think this is an example of when we fuse politics and identity and it goes wrong. Now, to the liberals, I think they can sometimes go a bit too far on this as well. I have gone as hard on abstention as anyone. I have made my case, and I think I managed to get at least a few more people to vote in 2020 and 2024 who might have been left abstainers otherwise. I've put my back to this one. To be clear, I think a lot of what the left are reacting to is we don't want to be blamed here. The primary blame for losing 2016 has to go to Hillary for running a poor campaign, and I agree, right? Because, there were 10,000 votes in one of the key states. Because it was so close, a lot of things were outcome determinative. Abstention was, but so was Comey's letter. So was the press focusing on emails as much as all Trump scandals combined. Probably there were some unforced errors on Hillary's part that might have changed things. So there's probably a dozen things that could have changed the outcome of that election, of which abstention is one. And it was definitely wrong, and they definitely just need to let that one go. But it wasn't the only one. And I think sometimes liberals, when they get into a really anti-left mood, can be like, this is the, single reason. And that does go too far, and I think the left, it's perhaps understandable that gets their hackles up a bit. I think generally to them, to your sort of mainline liberals, this looks like the left are at very best useful idiots for Trump, and at worst people who secretly sympathise with him. And from the liberal perspective, having this discussion can become incredibly frustrating because the stated defences and semi-defences and sort of kind of almost defences like Robbins for abstention are not the actual underlying reasons for it. The underlying reasons, like I say, are this complicated web of identitarian, purity, emotive, gendered components that people can't really defend on their own terms, and at any rate are largely subconscious. So when we rebut a point, the left just jumps to something else. It's like wrestling with smoke, because the stated reasons aren't the actual reasons. More than that, because we've now become the enemy, when we tell you our honest motivations, you just say that we're lying about them. Finally, and I think most importantly, there's a difference between loyalty to the party and being willing to throw you under the bus. Here's what I mean by that. When the left says, I don't think people should have to be forced to vote Democrat, no one's forcing you for one. We're saying you should. And they're saying, I don't think we should have to. I think what they hear is, I'm not reflexively loyal to the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party can't count on my support. What mainline liberals here, particularly women, particularly black people here, is we're willing to throw you under the bus. We're willing to compromise your bodily autonomy or your protection from terrifying bigots if you don't do what we say. It feels like blackmail, and it feels like a shakedown. That may not be how the left intend to be heard, but I am telling you that is how you are being heard. And that is one of the overwhelming reasons why mainline liberals who are very progressive on the issues will not go for you in primaries. Unlike some of the other narratives, which I think will need a more complicated renegotiation, my view on abstention is this just requires an unceremonious withdrawal. This is America leaving NAM. You got yourself in a bad position and you just need to leave. Like I say, this is not what Bernie launched his 2016 campaign about. We are now on a completely different set of conversations. And listen, you can tell by just the way I'm talking, I have been a partisan on the other side of these conversations, right? I'm not approaching this one from a neutral point of view. But I'm also telling you that this fight is stupid. I think we just need to let it go. And on our side, if the left lets abstention go, we need to stop bringing it up and holding it over your head. Like, if people admit they got it wrong, I don't think there's any sense now, for instance, in going back and trying to relitigate NADER 2020 and blaming people for that, because the people who did that have by and large admitted that they got it wrong, right? But the war now has become something that is untethered from its original causes. And yeah, like America just needs to withdraw from NAM. We just need to let this one go. I think seeing liberals actively work with them, be it participating in, say, the No Kings protests or showing up to vote for Mandani, will help. I think that's what we can do on our side. I think also Mandani shows the possibilities of a good candidate. He came off as the most partisan Democrat in that race, not Cuomo. And also the limits. There are still clearly some parts of the Democratic base that do not trust the left, and I think it will require repeated cycles of letting go of this to regain that trust. I don't think it will happen overnight. But that's abstention. That became a huge divide on the left following that. The final one is Bernie would have won. After Hillary lost, it became a narrative that the Democratic Party, through its cheating, inflicted this terrible candidate on us, knowing that Bernie was really popular, and it's their fault. This is another reason why it's the Democrats' fault that we got Trump. Now, this is definitely one that people have partly retconned. I think the motivation for Bernie being a fear of Trump and about electability, and that is not where people were at the time. No one was taking Trump that seriously at the time. But this is a more subtle legacy of 2016, is it really convinced the anti-establishment left that they were a majority of the country. Why? There's this insularity that I've talked a lot about. There's like very online subcultures. They talk mainly about politics to other people online who are very much within their tribe. Real world cultures, if you're a young college grad, probably most of the people you know are young college grads, and they're all going to be sort of predisposed to have the same sort of politics. Also canvassing. So one of the kind of funny things that came out of Bernie is a lot of people volunteered to go door knocking or, call phones for him in the final sort of stretches of the 2016 primary. And what would happen is you get a list of people and you'd see people posting online, my God, I talked to 20 people today and every one of them loved Bernie. And it's like, yes, of course every one of them loved Bernie, because you've got a GOTV list. You're going round people who the campaign has already identified as being Bernie Sanders supporters. They're not having you knock on Hillary Clinton supporters' doors to remind them to turn out, right? That wouldn't make any sense. But a lot of people participated in the campaign, and because they had this carefully selected audience for them, and there's nothing wrong with this is what you do in an election, they became so convinced that it was everyone in the country. And this again really feeds into this thing of it's the Democrats that are the problem. If only they would let us run this incredibly popular person, we'd win. So once again, we have data on this. You can poll Americans and ask them if they, for instance, think Kamala was to their right, if Kamala wasn't left-wing enough, and get a number for those who do. It's 6%. 6% of Americans think the Democratic Party isn't left-wing enough. And of that 6%, probably half will be loyal Democrats. I would answer yes to that question. My feeling is, and this is a guesstimate, that the view that the anti-establishment left ascribe to a majority of Americans, that people don't want to vote for Democrats because they're not left-wing enough, is probably no more than 2% of the country. Abstained specifically because the Democrats were not left enough will be smaller still. The high watermark for that was 2016, whereas we saw about a quarter of Bernie Sanders supporters, or 3.5 million people, didn't vote or voted third party, so 1% of the population. Now, here's where that debate can be a bit frustrating. 1% might be enough to tip a close election. It might have been enough to tip 2016. The Democrats still have to try and wrangle them up. But the people who speak for that group imagine themselves to be like a 60-70% supermajority thing. So they can't see why the party won't just fold to their every demand. They would win so easily if they did from their point of view. And I think this is just an empirical question. Like, you need to reckon with your relative size. Now, one thing I was asked when I posted about this is, how do you reconcile the left being that smaller part of the coalition with the left's policies polling often at plus 50%? And they're saying, and someone said, I'm not even saying you're wrong, but that feels frustratingly incoherent. Welcome to issue and identity polling. It is not coherent. Very short answer, yeah, it's weird. Many, many people see Kamala as too far left while supporting many of her policies. People's perceptions and votes tend to be driven by values, identity, and narratives more than they are by policy positions. Also, issue salience. There are people who will say yes to raising the minimum wage, but also feel that the white race is under attack. The latter is more important to them, and how they vote and how they think about Kamala, i.e. issue 2 liberal, is driven by the white race thing and not by the minimum wage thing. Finally, this isn't just a thing for like the left, the Bernie left. They might be the most extreme example, but progressive liberals, social democrats, centre-of-left types, anyone on the left side of the aisle basically, tends to do better on issue support than we do on identification or votes. And that's a fairly persistent pattern across time and across advanced democracies. Now, there's a more sensible version of this argument that goes, you'll be called far left anyway, so you might as well do the good stuff that excites people. To which I largely agree with. I certainly agree with the first part. Like, I think in a hyper-partisan age, you're going to be attacked as socialist anyway. Like, there's only so much to be gained from moderation. What I don't really think has been borne out is the second. I don't think that exact policy calibration really matters that much to electability. So, lay out a big vision and try to get the best of it you can through Congress. What seems to have been falsified is the other side of that, the implied political payoff. I think we've seen that an aggressive left agenda doesn't necessarily do that. In some ways, despite marketing himself as a moderate, Biden is proof of both sides. I don't think he was hurt by having a progressive agenda. Most people do not know what the IRA is or that it passed. But it also clearly didn't generate enthusiasm, which then translated into turnout and helped the Democrats win. Again, most people do not know what the IRA is that it passed. Now, there might be a more complicated version of this. Do big progressive policy, sell it well, and have a great media infrastructure to go with it, something like that. But the 101 doesn't work. Nevertheless, and dealing with those sort of two more nuanced versions, there really are some people who believe the more extreme version. The sort of self-identified left is 70% of the country. And again, the left is not a monolith. There are people who believe the more sensible version, there are people who believe the more extreme version. It's like when you debate religion, people will say, oh, well, no one really believes that the earth is 6,000 years old and that there were a real Adam and Eve and talking snake. It's a metaphor. Well, it's both, right? There's religious people who believe it as a metaphor, there's people who really believe it, and there's kind of people who are in between. Same stuff with some of these sort of empirically false claims that the left has become attached to. There's some lefties who believe a more sort of defensible and sensible version, and there's some who really sort of believe that the primary was rigged and they represent 70% of the country. From that follows a thought that the Democratic Party does not want to win, that it exists to block leftward change. In a sense, there's a huge contradiction in these narratives, right? The DNC is powerful enough to block the majority of the country in a primary, but powerless against Trump? That kind of doesn't hang together, right? Yet for some, that contradiction becomes a feature, not a bug. The jarring effect that narrative produces is not a reason to question it. It's one more thing to get angry about. Something that is very commonly said on the left is, man, if only the Democrats put as much effort into beating Republicans as they do beating lefties. Now, in reality, they do. Of course they do. They're a political party. They want to win elections. It's what they're for. But people really believe that. They really believe that the main thing that Democrats are self-consciously trying to achieve in the world is to block the left in primaries, not win general elections. Again, you can try and reason people out of that, intellectually, but there's these emotional and moral substructures, right? It's about how we feel, who we identify with, who we see as the villains. And I think possibly what we needed was some big wins to break the negative feedback loop, which hopefully we just got in New York. But there does need to be a conscious change to go with it. There will be defeats in the future, and it'll be very easy to retreat back into these false but comforting and emotionally and identitarianly validating narratives. Final thought. Does this matter? Yeah, I think it does. I think, like I say, these divides, and I focused on three areas. The Democrats stole it from us, the abstention thing, and the Bernie would have won thing. Those have kind of created the contours of our current politics. Now, the exact backstory to all of that isn't something that a lot of people are aware of, but some are very invested in, and it does filter out. I've seen some polling recently that affects there's very different views of the Democratic Party between people under and over 40. Under 40 really feel it is not fighting hard enough on key issues, particularly money in politics and inequality, whereas older people do. Well, that's an anti-establishment left narrative. Now, whether or not that's true or not, let's just put to one side. I think it's complicated. I think in some ways the Democrats are better than people say, and in some ways they are kind of letting us down. Put that to one side. That is an example of getting out into the world. I know a lot of people sort of my age and younger, particularly younger, who have really sort of absorbed this idea of like the Democrats don't want to win. Now, they wouldn't have all of the detail or the backstory or be able to sort of connect it up in the way that someone who's invested in the debate is, but it does sort of get out into the world, right? I think we have this, we sometimes say online isn't real life, but it is, it's real people. And like that can filter out, you know, these quite insular online conversations can filter out into more mainline online conversations like Instagram or Facebook or so on. And then they can also just filter into the conversations people are having. I also think this divide has unquestionably impacted the strength of the anti-Trump coalition. It's not the main factor. Again, as with abstention, I think it is something that has certainly not helped, but I don't want to say it's the only thing. It's not fair to say it's the only thing. It isn't. But I think the fact that the lefts, broadly, progressives, liberals, mainline people, lefties, all of us, our messaging has kind of been divided against itself. That a lot of our online new media messaging has been sort of spent yelling at the party to do more to fight Trump, instead of just yelling about fascism. Throughout the Trump era, I think has been to our detriment. I think we've also very much been talking past each other for the entire Trump era. I'm probably guilty of this. Like I say, I'm clearly a partisan of the mainline liberal side of things, but I have tried to note areas where I think the mainline liberals haven't heard what the left is saying. I've tried to be fair to the left. I think while the narratives took it too far, they were right to be frustrated about like the Clinton DNC arrangement. They were right to feel a bit sore about that. I think some of the ways that we've talked to the left have talked past them or not really understood where they're coming from. And I think some people have gone too far in arguing against them, and, you know, I'm very clear where I think the left needs to change. I think that divide has just not served us. I think we've been at each other's throats when the right has been united, and it shows in the outcomes. I also think, you know, if you're a partisan of the sort of Bernie side, it has impacted the ability of the American political system to give us radical paths forward. Because you're the people, you, the Bernie left, who should be providing those radical paths forward, who should at least there be an option on the table for, like, look, I mean, here's where I'm at. The liberalism of the long 90s was not bad, it wasn't malicious or evil, but it was naive. It really didn't consider something like this coming, and we're in a place now where we need a new vision for the future, and I'm open to radical ideas, right? We want someone in our political system providing them. The overturn window has definitely got wider, and yet because the left has been locked into narratives that do not make sense and are profoundly alienating to the bulk of the Democratic Party primary electorate, they have been unable to provide that, right? And it isn't, it will always be the case that running a challenge against an incumbent is a bit of an uphill struggle. That will always be a difficult thing to do, but it is not an impossible thing to do by any means. And I would have liked it if the left could have learned to just move on from some of this sooner. I think we would be in a much better place in terms of being able to provide radical options to the Democratic primary electorate. But with all that said, yes, I think this has hurt us, and this is real, and this is worth talking about. It's not just a few idiots arguing online. This has filtered out into the world. I do feel like we might be turning a corner. But it's not guaranteed. What do we need to do to keep turning that corner? I don't have all the answers, but here's a few thoughts. First, both mainline liberalism and the Democratic Party have evolved in a number of ways that I think the left wanted them to. In many ways, the left has won the battles it originally went to war on. It's just lost the battles that it's now fighting. And I think this is positive. So, you know, Biden, like I say, did take on board the not doing the compromise first thing, did take on board just going spend big on left-wing policies. And I think the Democratic Party is in a much more progressive place now, and that's good, and I want to fight to keep it there, because after losing in 2024, there are people who are saying, oh, you've got to abandon immigrants, or you've got to abandon trans people, or you've got to start moderating on this and that, and I don't want us to. I don't think we need to. I don't think it'll help us. So just stand on what we know is right? And I think we want to continue doing that. I think if the Democratic Party does go the reactionary centrist route of abandoning trans people or immigrants, the left will rightly turn on them, right? More so than it already is. So I think continue doing that. I think on the left side, understand that liberals feel like we've already met you halfway. We've already given a lot of policy concessions over the Biden presidency, and you just yelled at Biden and us about being pro-genocide, right? Which I think felt unfair to a lot of liberals. I'm not saying you need to agree that all of that is right. I'm saying that is how people feel, and just sort of approach it with that understanding. I think for Democrats particularly, one thing that they've been doing effectively is put themselves in the story personally, and in a way that involves some risk. So Brad Lander getting arrested as walking an immigrant into court, or Senator Van Hollen going out to see Garcia in El Salvador, or I forget her name, but there was a congresswoman who got indicted. Politics that takes some level of personal risk, I think the left has responded well to, much more than... They want actions, not words, and I don't think they're wrong to want that. I think that's what the Democrats can keep doing. I think, overall, at the start of the revolt, the left had the better story. It had a story with clearer morals and clearer emotional valence. But liberals have adapted since then, and the left has backed itself into a series of corners and are now defending positions that are incoherent. Like I say, this is not where you'd start from. I think the left just needs to come out of those corners, and I think that liberals, even more than we're already doing, need to speak a story that has a clearer emotional resonance. It needs a villain, right? The villain, in this case, I think, is fascism. I think the story we are telling is very simple. We are in a moment where fascists are trying to take over the state. These are disgusting, grotesque, despicable people, and they need to be opposed with everything we have. And I think what needs to be added to that, and where collaboration with the left can help us add to that, is what is our vision of what comes next when we win, right? I think liberals, including myself, can sometimes be in a bit of like Dr. Spock mode when we need to be in hearts and minds mode. We need to speak, yes, to the consequences of abstention, but also to the purity and expressivist side. I think the left assumes often that we're coming from a place of deference to the Democratic Party. We're not. We're coming from a place of opposition to Trump. And I think the way to put that is being an anti-fascist is a core part of my identity. This isn't an abstract policy. Core to who I am is opposing these people. Now, one of the things, not the only thing, but one of the things that follows from that is, yeah, you've got to vote for their opponents, right? Not about liking them or not, but just any and all means of opposing fascism has to be used. But I think we can be a bit clearer about the emotional identitarian place that we're starting from. Our core thing is opposing fascism. I think even on the issue of purity and contamination, you know, there are ways we can approach that better. I think we might ask, for instance, we all understand there's no ethical consumption under capitalism. We all understand the world is contaminating in many ways. Why is voting the thing we've locked onto? That just doesn't seem productive, right? And are there ways we can decontaminate the act? I always love the example of, in the 2020 French election, the French socialist left voted for Jacques Chirac, a corrupt centre-right politician, in order to see off Le Pen, an out-and-out old-school fascist, and set up water baths to literally wash their hands after they came out of a polling station. I think that is fantastic, and that very literally addresses the purity concern on its own terms, and I am very open to things like that. In general, we have been stuck in negative feedback loops, discursive negative feedback loops, for a decade now. And I think No Kings and Madami's victory give us the possibility to get into positive feedback loops, where the left can now start to feel like part of the Democratic Party because they are winning primaries and becoming part of it. Where liberals can feel like the left are allies again because they are being allies. And where the left can feel like liberals are allies to them because they are being allies in showing up in direct action. A first-time voter now would have been 9 in 2016. We are raising a generation of political actors on the shadows of grievances. Young people entering politics now often really hate the Democratic Party, but couldn't really explain why. It's just all that they've been taught. On the other side now, there are many people I know who are polarised against the left because all they've ever seen of them is what appears to be apologetics for Republicans. I am not a neutral party. I am a partisan of this fight. I think mainline liberals have, by and large, had the best of it, although we have made mistakes too. But it is time for this to end, and for us to move on to something else. Do we want to be here in another 10 years? How much more divorced from reality will the conversation be by then? How utterly I wouldn't start from here will our grievances be? How much more will have been lost? Thank you for listening.